Listened out for any hint of who the unknown caller might be, as her husband lifted the receiver. After a few polite words, he had turned and offered the phone to her, whispering that it was their old friend Enid on the other end of the line. Bonnie could not help but smile as she had lifted the receiver to her ear, aware that she had not spoken to Enid Jolson for over a year. The subsequent conversation had gone on for some time, with Jolson informing Bonnie that she was quite well, and that she had recently moved to a nursing home much closer to the McConnell residence. The call had ended with Bonnie promising to visit the following day, and that she would purchase a bottle of Enid's favourite brandy on her way over. But the old lady's tone had suddenly changed, remarking that she had no need for such advices anymore. With that, the phone call ended. This unexpected contact from their old friend took up the majority of the McConnell's dinner conversation that evening, with Bonnie eagerly looking forward to her trip across town. The next morning, upon asking the receptionist at the nursing home which room Enid was in, the look she had received was one of concern. The worker had informed her that unfortunately, Mrs. Jolson had recently passed away, offering sympathy for Bonnie's loss and apologies for her wasted journey. Shocked at the news, Bonnie inquired as to how this had happened, as she had only spoken to her friend the night before. Almost immediately, a confused expression fell upon the receptionist's face. In a soothing tone, she politely informed the visitor that she must be mistaken, as she had been on duty when Mrs. Jolson had been found deceased in her bed the previous morning, many hours before the alleged phone call had taken place. In their 1979 book, Phone Calls from the Dead, parapsychologists Raymond Bayliss and D. Scott Rogo examine the aforementioned phenomenon in great depth. For as long as there have been methods of electronic communication between the living, there have been reports that spirits of the departed are somehow able to access these devices and make contact from beyond the grave. Having looked at numerous examples of this, the authors noted several common themes. The majority of such contacts occurred within the first 24 hours of the deceased caller having passed on, although in a limited number of cases, this period could be extended for up to 2 years. A significant number of the callers seemed to be almost confused or disorientated for the duration of the call, discussing subjects which were either cryptic or irrelevant with the recipient. Quite often, the witnesses involved reported that the quality of the line was very poor, with the words being spoken difficult to distinguish because of static or white noise. In addition, it was common for the voice of the speaker to be described as muffled or metallic, sometimes sounding as if they were standing some distance from the handset. Eventually, after analysing and assessing the various reports they had managed to unearth, the two scientists formed the opinion that such calls could be divided into 2 different categories. The first of these classifications involves receiving a call from someone who has passed away, although the caller does not speak when the phone is answered. The second presents as a seemingly innocuous call from a loved one, where it is later discovered that the conversation should have been impossible, as the friend or relative in question had recently passed on. In the spring of 1969, a young man named Carl had rented a cottage for a weekend vacation. On arriving at his accommodation, the holidaymaker was pleasantly surprised to find an old-fashioned telephone handset sitting on the bedside table. But on the first evening of his trip, he had been drifting off to sleep when he was unexpectedly awoken by the sound of the phone ringing insistently beside him. Half asleep and glancing at his wristwatch, Cole could see that it was 11:15 p.m., which led him to believe that the call must be important. Lifting the handset, he was somewhat bewildered to hear his father's voice on the other end of the line, informing him that his mother needed to speak with him. When he tried to ask what the issue was, his father had continued to speak, almost as if he was not hearing Carl's replies. The younger man had become increasingly concerned and frustrated as he was repeatedly urged to call her. He demanded to know why his father could not simply pass the phone over, as his mother should have been there with him. After a minute or two, having made no progress, his father had suddenly made reference to the fact that he was in a beautiful place, and then hung up. Replacing the receiver, Carl had then tried several times to call his parents' home number, only to find that the phone on the nightstand seemed unable to make outgoing calls. Irritated, he got out of bed and searched the rest of the cottage for another phone, only to discover that the one in the bedroom appeared to be the only phone inside the premises. Having struggled to sleep that night, Carl had risen early the following morning and made his way into the nearest town so that he could place a call to his parents. Upon locating a public phone booth, he was shocked to discover from relatives that his mother was unable to speak to him at that time, as she was still far too upset. She had been lying in bed with his father the previous evening when he had suddenly begun to convulse, dying of a heart attack a short time later. On making further inquiries with his family, he was even more unnerved to discover the time of his father's death, which had been recorded by the attending paramedics as 11:15 p.m. It was only afterwards, as he had hurriedly packed his things back at the cottage, that the bewildered and traumatized holidaymaker discovered that the phone by his bed was purely ornamental and had never been connected to a working phone line. During the course of some of these exchanges, the caller demonstrates a definite purpose or agenda as they speak, determined to ensure that the reason for their call is fully understood by the recipient. It is during these incidents that Bayliss and Rogo noticed the highest percentage of allegedly robotic or distorted speech patterns reported by witnesses. Perhaps the most famous example of this kind of call, and indeed the most high-profile person to have allegedly received one, is horror author Dean Koontz. In September of 1988, Koontz had been at work when his office phone began to ring. As his number was unlisted and only known to a select group of people, the writer had answered, reasoning it must be important. For a few seconds, there had been no sound on the line save for crackling and static. But then, a female voice had suddenly uttered the phrase, "Please be careful." Bewildered, Koontz had inquired as to the caller's identity, only for her to ignore the question and instead repeat her request 2 further times before hanging up. After the call, and as only a few people knew his office phone number, Koontz spent time puzzling over the caller's identity. She had sounded much like his grandmother, but she had died some 20 years prior. Finally, reasoning that it must be a mistake or prank, he had shrugged the incident off and carried on with his work. 2 days later, whilst he was visiting his father at a care home, the old man had become confused and agitated. The incident quickly escalated to the point where staff had left Dean struggling with his father, who had gone on to arm himself with a fishing knife. After what seemed an eternity, Koontz was finally able to disarm him. At that exact moment, a police officer arrived and aimed his weapon at the author, mistakenly thinking he was attacking the old man. The words from the strange phone call 2 days before had hit Koontz like a sledgehammer. In a heartbeat, he dropped the knife and backed away. For years afterwards, Koontz would relate to people how, if he had not suddenly realised the significance of the call from his deceased grandmother, he he would likely have walked towards the officer holding the knife and would probably have been shot as a consequence. Of course, the direction of these calls is not always one way. There are examples in which a living person may phone somebody only to find out afterwards that the person they spoke to had died before the call was even made. In these cases, there is often far less of a tangible link between the parties involved, and the conversations are usually much more mundane in nature. One such example which the parapsychologists cited in their work was that of an employee at a phone company named Mary, who in late April of 1985 had attempted to close a sales call to a residential number in Pennsylvania. The call had been answered by what sounded like an older woman, who identified herself as Mrs. B, the wife of the homeowner. Mary immediately began to recite her tried and tested sales script, inquiring who the family's current telecoms provider was, and gently increasing the pressure when she was subsequently informed it was AT&T. For a time, the saleswoman sensed that she may be close to successfully closing on a new contract. But then, just prior to the end of the call, Mrs. B had somewhat relented, stating that her husband was a lifelong and loyal AT&T customer and would not want to change providers. On inquiring if she could speak with him, Mary was told that he was unavailable at that time. He had recently retired and was always out fishing. Having noted down that the couple were unhappy with what they were being charged by their existing provider, Mary then agreed a time to phone back and ended the call. The following evening, she rang the couple at the pre-arranged time and was relieved that on this occasion, it was a male voice that answered. However, upon identifying herself, the conversation quickly became uncomfortable, with the man stating that he did not appreciate cold callers trying to sell him things he had no interest in buying. Used to being rebuffed by reluctant customers, Mary had apologized for the intrusion and stated that there must be some misunderstanding, as she had spoken to the man's wife the day before and that they had agreed on an appropriate time to call back. For a few moments, the line had remained silent. The man then became angry, stating that the reason he had not been home the day before was because he was at his wife's funeral. The line then went dead as he terminated the call. When examining these cases, it seems easy to dismiss out of hand the idea of people being contacted by the dead. Often it is alleged that the person receiving the call must have been tired or mistaken about what they heard on the line. Sometimes incidents are explained away as dreams or the product of overactive imaginations. The fact that in most cases there is no tangible evidence to prove the call ever took place offers no lead in finding the truth of the matter. Witnesses have reported that the dead have phoned them from withheld or private numbers, sometimes from phone numbers they recognize, or those which are already saved in their device. But examination of call histories and phone bills never show any record of these communications, only further undermining the testimony of those reporting them. But this does not necessarily prove that the witness didn't experience something strange. Bayliss and Rogo postulated that in these occurrences, no call ever takes place. Instead, the spirits of the dead might merely manipulate communications devices to give the impression that a call was received. Some commentators have attempted to tie these experiences to other phenomena. For instance, a middle-aged woman traveling through Nebraska one evening observed a strange object in the skies which followed her car for nearly 2 hours. Just as she returned home, her phone began to ring. The man who spoke to her on the other end of the line had a metallic tone to his voice and identified himself as Roger. When she informed him that she didn't know anyone by that name, he told her that he was her brother and then hung up. The woman, who was an only child, shrugged the incident off as a wrong number. But some years later she learned that long before she was born, her mother had given birth to a stillborn baby boy, who, had he survived, would have been named Roger. She couldn't help feeling that the sighting of the strange object and the subsequent phone call were somehow related. The fact remains that these instances are so commonly reported throughout the world, from witnesses across multiple communities and backgrounds, that it seems almost cynical to simply pretend they do not happen. If the spirits of the dead can manifest themselves physically to their loved ones, leaving no trace of their appearance, then why should they not be able to do the same in utilizing technology? Perhaps the most defining characteristic of this phenomenon, unlike others we have examined, is the positivity surrounding these interactions. During such conversations, recipients receive important information from the callers, often providing them with one final, unexpected chance to speak with their loved ones. And in some cases, such calls have even been known to help an individual avoid misfortune or tragedy. Regardless of whether these phone calls are a supernatural phenomenon or a trick of the mind, there is no denying the beneficial impact they have on those involved. The opportunity to speak with a loved one last time and make peace before they are finally gone is a truly heartwarming and life-affirming thought. For those of you who, like me, choose to ignore calls from withheld numbers, just know that it might be from someone you least expect. As she had heard, he had been going out hunting for the weekend and was now failing to answer his phone. Promising to look into the matter, Smith retrieved his coffee and went on to ask his colleagues if anyone had seen the missing Clark during their travels over the weekend. A popular and easygoing guy, well known around the town of Nome, it wasn't surprising when two local officers did recall having recently seen Balderas' car parked out near mile 44 on the Nome Council Highway. After clearing things with his superior and phoning Bowie with a quick update, Smith then grabbed hold of the keys to his cruiser and made his way out of town towards the location. Sure enough, as the marker post for mile 44 came into view, Smith could see a dark blue Dakota truck parked up on a nearby verge. Having checked the parked vehicle was secured and unattended, Smith had proceeded to remove the loudhailer from inside the cruiser and then call out for the missing man several times. All he received was silence, which seemed to grow more ominous with each passing second. Checking the Dakota once more, he saw no signs of damage and no obvious tracks leading away into the bushes alongside it. The state trooper considered the parked truck for a moment and began to feel a familiar tingling sensation as the hairs on the back of his neck bristled with unease. Shortly afterwards, at his insistence, additional units were soon on their way, in possession of thermal cameras and search dogs. But when the hounds had been walked up to the vehicle in order to catch its owner's scent, they had proceeded to track only a little further down the road before coming to an abrupt halt. Despite several more attempts and the repeated urging of their handlers, the pair of tracker dogs instead remained sitting stubbornly on the spot where they had come to rest, in the middle of the highway, several yards from the abandoned vehicle, with no forward progress in any direction. It was as if the missing man had simply ceased to exist on that very spot. At the time of writing, it has been 6 years since Joseph Balderas set out alone to hunt game in the countryside around his hometown and never returned. The search for him would last 5 months, involving workers from numerous law enforcement agencies and emergency services, and costing tens of thousands of dollars. But no clue as to the fate of the missing hunter was ever uncovered, and 12 months later, he was declared legally dead by a local court. The Balderas case remains one of the most mystifying and frustrating missing persons cases in the history of the city of Nome. The 36-year-old was a fit and healthy outdoorsman who held a position of responsibility within the local community and was part of a large circle of family and friends. Balderas had no known medical or mental health issues at the time of his disappearance and was in the process of making plans to marry his fiancée and move across state to settle down in Juneau. Investigators have never been able to come up with a viable hypothesis